You know that feeling when there's a thinker, someone whose name just keeps popping up, and you know they're important,
Hmm.
but actually diving into their work feels, well, a bit daunting. Like, you should get them, but finding the way in is tricky.
Oh, absolutely. And Simone de Beauvoir can definitely feel like that sometimes, a truly significant figure. But yeah, the sheer volume of her work can seem overwhelming.
Exactly. So today, that's what we're doing. We're going to try and navigate that, really pinpoint why Simone de Beauvoir, the French philosopher, novelist, 1908 to 86, right, in that whole phenomenological existentialist scene, why she still matters so much.
And you really can't talk about Beauvoir without almost immediately talking about the second sex.
Right, 1949.
Yeah, 1949 is just,
Yeah,
it's the foundational text. So much of what we call second wave feminism really builds on that bedrock.
groundbreaking, no doubt. And it's all kind of captured in that incredibly famous line, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman.
That line.
Okay, let's sit with that for a second. What is it about that statement? What's the core insight that makes it just so revolutionary?
Well, the truly radical thing there is this idea that womanhood isn't some fixed biological destiny. It's not just a given.
Right.
It's a social construct. Society, culture, history,
You
all these forces shape and define what it means to be a woman. It's something you learn, an identity you grow into, not something you just inherently are.
Which implies if it's constructed.
It can be deconstructed. It
Yeah.
can be changed. Exactly. That's the power of it.
Right. And, while the second sex gets and deserves so much attention for that feminist analysis, it's also really important to remember, and our sources definitely stress this, that Beauvoir was a major philosopher in her own right.
Oh, for sure.
Her contributions went way beyond feminism, even if they were sometimes maybe overshadowed a bit during her lifetime.
Precisely. Her philosophical thinking was much broader than just that one, albeit massively important, book.
So our mission today, for you listening, is basically this. We're going to sift through the material we've looked at, analyses, articles, bits of her own writing, and pull out the really essential stuff. Give you a solid grasp of Beauvoir's key ideas, her influence, without getting totally lost in the weeds of dense academic theory. How's that sound?
Sounds like a plan, a very necessary plan. So, where do we start? Her philosophical roots.
Yeah, I think we have to. And it feels impossible to talk about her early development without immediately bringing up Jean-Paul Sartre.
No way around it. Their lifelong partnership it was. Well, it was clearly this incredibly intense intellectual connection for both of them.
Right. Constant dialogue, shaping each other's thoughts.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, while Sartre often gets the main credit for popularizing existentialism, it's worth remembering Beauvoir's own early works, like Pyrrhus and Cineas in 44 and The Ethics of Ambiguity in 47. These were developing really original existentialist themes right alongside his work, not just following him.
And here's something I found fascinating in the research. The suggestion that Beauvoir actually had maybe a deeper grasp of Heidegger than Sartre did.
Yes, that's a really important point.
Even though Sartre is the one more often linked with bringing Heidegger's ideas, to a wider French audience, that nuance feels significant.
It really does. It shows her own independent, rigorous engagement with those core existentialist thinkers. And she wasn't just doing philosophy and essays, right? She was exploring these huge ideas in her novels, too.
She came to stay.
She came to stay in 43. All men are mortal in 46.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So using fiction almost like a laboratory to see how these big concepts, freedom, responsibility, the other, actually play out in people's lives and relationships.
Exactly. Her novels are a fantastic way to see those existential themes made concrete, to feel their weight in lived experience. And it wasn't just their individual writing either. Remember, 1945, she co-founds Les Temps Modernes.
Right. That journal was huge.
With Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. That really put them right at the center of French intellectual life post-war.
Definitely. Okay, let's pull back a bit to her background. Born into this Parisian bourgeois family, but they faced financial problems.
Yeah, that tension seems important, and her father really encouraged her reading, her education.
And she was deeply religious early on, right? Even thought about becoming a nun.
Yes, which makes her shift to atheism around age 14 even more striking. That questioning of authority, of given truths, must have started pretty early.
That's a huge shift. And then there's the relationship with Sartre itself. So unconventional.
Totally. That idea of their necessary love but accepting contingent lovers on the side, I mean, that challenged everything about traditional partnership back then.
It really did. And their intellectual journey together really takes off at the École Normale Supérieure.
Hmm.
That agrégation de philosophie exam in 1927, quite something for both of them.
And for Beauvoir especially, I mean, passing it at 21, making her the youngest professeur agrégé ever in France.
Incredible. Just shows her sheer intellectual horsepower.
Absolutely. And that period, studying Kierkegaard, Husserl, and crucially Heidegger together, that was formative.
Heidegger's concept of unveiling, can you maybe just quickly explain that? Dasein's authentic self-revelation.
Sure. So, very simply put, Heidegger's unveiling is about how we, as human beings, Dasein authentically reveal ourselves and our possibilities in the world. It's about confronting our existence openly.
Okay. And Beauvoir takes this idea.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how she develops it with arguably a more optimistic slant than Sartre. You know, Sartre famously called man a useless passion.
Right. Pretty bleak.
Yeah, but Beauvoir, through this concept of unveiling, seems to find a ground for seeing humans as fundamentally free, open to possibility, even open to the joy of existence. You really see that hopefulness in the ethics of ambiguity in Pyrrhus and Cineas.
So a slightly less angsty existentialism, more focused on potential.
Kind of, yeah. It's a subtle but important difference. And it wasn't all just theory. The sources mention how practical she was helping Sartre, even writing articles for him sometimes, and during the occupation.
A really tough time.
Incredibly tough. And she was apparently quite instrumental in just keeping their wider circle afloat, finding resources, looking after people.
Shows real strength.
Yeah.
Which paradoxically makes you think,
Hmm.
here's this incredibly strong, brilliant woman with these radical ideas.
Hmm.
And yet she still experienced being the other simply because she was a woman in that society, even within her own relationships with powerful men like Sartre.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it? It really highlights how deep those societal structures run the very structures she was about to dissect so powerfully.
Which brings us right back to the second sex.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did she actually build that argument? What tools did she use?
Well, it's this amazing blend. She took Husserl's phenomenological method, focusing on lived experience, how things actually appear to us.
Right, starting from the ground up.
Exactly. And combined that with Heidegger's ideas about Dasein, about being in the world, to analyze how womanhood gets constructed historically and philosophically. And Merleau-Ponty's idea that man is a historical idea, that was in the mix too.
So, looking at how our understanding of ourselves is shaped by time and culture. And she brought in other big thinkers too, didn't she? Hegel, Marx.
Yes, definitely. She used Hegel's master-slave dialectic, that idea of the self defining itself against an other, to show how men historically position themselves as the essential self, making women the inessential other.
Okay, I see.
And drawing on Marx, particularly his early writings, she argued that things like women's role in reproduction, their exclusion from economic production, being confined to being mothers and wives, all this pushed them into that position of absolute otherness.
Wow, that's a pretty devastating analysis of the structures in place. How did that go down at the time?
In France? Not well. Not well at all, initially. The reception was largely hostile, even vitriolic.
Really?
Oh, yeah. She got intense personal attacks, accused of wanting to destroy marriage, the family, motherhood, just for advocating women's freedom, including things like abortion rights. The sheer volume of hate mail she received was apparently staggering.
Yikes. But then it gets translated into English.
And everything changes. Well, a lot changes. When it hit the U.S. in 1953, and then got that wider 1963 translation, it was huge, transformative.
So it became like the book for second-wave feminism.
Pretty much, especially in the U.S. It landed right alongside things like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, providing this really powerful philosophical backbone for the movement.
Giving feminists the intellectual tools to understand what they were fighting against.
Precisely. It gave them a framework for understanding the depth of women's oppression, and it influenced so many other key feminist writers at that time. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch. They all owe a debt to Beauvoir.
Though, it's fair to say, later feminists also brought critiques, right? Looking back at the second sex.
Oh, absolutely. And those critiques are important. Third-wave feminists, people like Bell Hooks or Maxine Hong Kingston, they pointed out quite rightly that Beauvoir's analysis mostly centered on the experience of, well, educated, upper-middle-class white women.
Right. didn't fully capture the intersections of race, class, other differences.
Exactly. So it highlighted the need for a more inclusive feminist analysis, which is part of the ongoing evolution of feminist thought, you know?
And the movements themselves developed differently too, didn't they? Europe versus the U.S.
Yeah, generally speaking, European feminism after Beauvoir often maintained stronger ties to Marxism, whereas the U.S. movement leaned more towards liberalism. But interestingly, even as intellectual fashions changed, the shift towards structuralism, post-structuralism,
Mm.
Beauvoir has remained this incredibly revered figure, especially in France. Even post-structuralist feminists like Kristeva, Rigoret, Sixus, they all acknowledge her massive influence. Her groundwork still holds.
So her legacy there is secure, even with the later critiques and shifts.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly,
Yeah.
because she wasn't just an essayist or philosopher. She was a novelist, a very successful one. How did those two things connect for her? I think it's fair to say her novels are philosophy, in a way. They're explorations of her ideas, but through characters, through situations, through lived experience. It's like she's testing her concepts in the real world, or a fictional version of it.
You mentioned She Came to Stay before. That's a good example of this.
A perfect example. It's a roman à clef, a novel based on real people and events. In this case, her complicated ménage à trois with Sartre and Olga Kosakiewicz.
Right.
But woven through that very personal story are these early, really crucial explorations of concepts like the look, how we feel objectified by another's gaze and the other. Ideas that, as the sources note, Sartre would later make absolutely central to being and nothingness.
So she was working these ideas out in fiction first, almost.
It really seems that way sometimes. Fiction was a vital space for her philosophical development, and she got major recognition for it too, winning the Prix Goncourt, France's biggest literary prize, for The Mandarins in 1954.
Another novel drawing on real life, right? Her affair with Nelson Algren.
Exactly. So her fiction reached a wide audience, maybe brought these complex ideas to people who wouldn't pick up a dense philosophical text. Now, speaking of her life and her commitment to authenticity, things get a bit more complicated when we look at some controversies that came up later.
Yeah, this is where it gets difficult. The sources mention her signing that Vichy certificate about not being Jewish or Masonic, working for the Nazi-controlled radio.
It's uncomfortable stuff, isn't it? Especially for someone so deeply invested in ideas of freedom and truth.
How do we square that?
Well, it's crucial to remember the context. Life under Nazi occupation was incredibly perilous. People made compromises to survive. But it definitely raises tough ethical questions, especially for intellectuals. What responsibility did they have? Was compliance, even passive compliance, acceptable? Could silence have been worse? There aren't easy answers. It's still debated.
No, definitely not easy. And then there are the revelations about her relationships with some of her students, teenage students.
Yes, that's deeply troubling. The lawsuit brought by Natalie Sorokin's mother, even though it was dismissed after denials, brought these relationships into the open.
And it's led to significant criticism, understandably.
Absolutely. It raises serious ethical questions about power dynamics, consent, and her judgment in those personal situations. It's a very difficult aspect of her biography to grapple with.
And one more point, the sources raise her and Sartre's continued support for the Soviet Union, even when knowledge of Stalin's atrocities became more widespread.
Yeah, that's another complex area. It points to perhaps some ideological blind spots, a willingness to overlook harsh realities in favor of a political commitment. It adds another layer of contradiction to these incredibly influential figures.
It really does. Okay, let's pivot back to her core philosophical ideas, specifically her ethics. We touched on Pyrrhus and Cineas and the ethics of ambiguity. What's the main thrust there?
The core focus is really on ethical responsibility. Responsibility to yourself, yes, but very importantly, responsibility towards others and particularly towards those who are oppressed.
So it's not just about my own freedom.
Not at all. In Pyrrhus and Cineas, she uses that dialogue, Pyrrhus wanting to conquer the world, Cineas asking, and then what? To explore the fundamental question of why we act. What's the point? What justifies our projects in the world?
And this is where she differs a bit from Sartre's early work, his focus on the conflict within the individual.
Exactly. While Sartre's being and nothingness initially emphasizes that struggle between my consciousness, being for itself, and the world, being in itself, Beauvoir brings in the ethical relationship with other free subjects right from the start. For her, the other isn't just a threat or an object.
They're necessary for my own freedom.
Yes, my freedom needs the recognition and the freedom of others to be fully realized. It's fundamentally relational.
That's a really important shift. And this idea of transcendence through projects.
Right. We achieve meaning, we transcend just being there by freely choosing projects and pouring our energy into them. We establish their value ourselves, not because some external authority tells us to. Freedom of choice is key.
And she's critical of anything that demands we give up that freedom.
Very critical. Institutions, ideologies, abstract concepts like the state or humanity, if they demand you renounce your individual freedom for their sake, she sees that as unethical.
So even things like relationships of domination or maybe even intense devotion, she sees choices being made there.
Yes. She argues that even in constrained situations, people make choices. There's still an element of responsibility. While acknowledging systemic oppression, she insists on our moral duty not just to avoid harming others, but to actively will their freedom too. Our actions are like a call to other freedoms.
But it's risky, right? Because we're finite. The world is uncertain.
Exactly. Our projects are never guaranteed. There's always ambiguity, which leads us right into the ethics of ambiguity.
Okay. So what's the core argument in that book?
She confronts that fundamental ambiguity head-on. Human existence is this messy, uncertain mix of inner freedom, our ability to choose, and external facticity, the concrete limits of our situation, our bodies, the world.
We can't escape either side.
Right. And trying to escape that ambiguity, pretending we're all freedom or all determined, that's bad faith. Living ethically, for Beauvoir, means embracing that tension, living authentically right in the middle of it.
And how do we do that? The existentialist conversion.
That's the term, yeah. It means consciously taking up your freedom, choosing your projects spontaneously from yourself, not because of some pre-given absolute end goal. The value comes from the choosing itself, as she puts it so brilliantly.
Go on.
To will oneself moral and to will oneself free are one and the same decision.
Wow. That really ties it together. Freedom and morality are inseparable.
For her, absolutely. And that's why she criticizes philosophers like Hegel, these thinkers of the absolute. She feels they risk crushing the individual under the weight of universal concepts.
But she's not saying we're just isolated individuals.
No, not at all. She's clear that we're always situated, always in community, always interconnected. Individual freedom matters, but it exists with others.
And she talks about childhood, how freedom develops.
Yes, she sees childhood as a time where values are mostly given, not chosen what she calls the serious attitude. It's natural for a child, but clinging to that seriousness as an adult, blindly accepting external values without question, that's a way of fleeing freedom.
That's the serious man attitude she critiques.
That's one of them, yeah. She outlines several types of bad faith. The subman who denies freedom altogether, the nihilist who denies all value, the adventurer who acts without commitment. But the serious man is key, the one who subordinates their freedom to some external absolute, like an ideology or a cause.
Okay, and then she brings in situation and mystification. How do those concepts work?
This is where her ethics and her analysis of oppression really connect. Some situations, like being enslaved or like the historical situation of many women, are structured in ways that make exercising freedom incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Because of external power.
Exactly. And mystification is the ideological process that makes the oppressed believe their situation is natural or inevitable or deserved. It masks the reality of oppression and prevents revolt by making people accept their lack of freedom.
So true ethical action has to recognize this. It has to understand that my freedom depends on everyone else's.
Precisely. You can't authentically will your own freedom while being indifferent to the oppression of others. Inaction, in the face of oppression, becomes a form of complicity, and concrete individuals always matter more than abstract causes. The ends don't justify the means if the means involve crushing someone's freedom.
So when we look back at everything, her philosophy, her feminism, her life, what's the lasting takeaway? What's her core legacy?
It's immense, really. Her impact on philosophy, on ethics, and obviously profoundly on feminism is just undeniable. Her work is still so relevant for thinking about equality, oppression, freedom, responsibility.
And it wasn't just those main books either. She wrote travelogues that study on aging.
America, Day by Day, The Long March, The Coming of Age. Yeah, it shows the incredible range of her mind, her engagement with the world, and her autobiographies.
4 volumes, right? Plus the accounts of her mother's death and Sartre's death.
They offer such rich insights into her life, her times, her thinking. Across all of it, the consistent thread is this challenge to basic assumptions about being a woman, about being human, always emphasizing freedom, choice, responsibility, but also the power of social construction.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe the thing to reflect on is that central idea of hers, becoming rather than just being. How does that resonate for you, listening now in your own life, in the world you see around you?
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. If Beauvoir's analysis of woman as other was so powerful, how can we use her framework, her ideas about situation, mystification, the interconnectedness of freedom to understand other kinds of inequality today? The ongoing struggles for liberation and recognition for all sorts of groups.
Lots to think about. And if this has piqued your interest, if you want to go deeper, diving into the second sex itself, or maybe starting with her autobiographies, well, that would be a great next step into the world of Simone de Beauvoir.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.